On a quiet spring evening in Blue Ridge, Georgia, Kaylee Thornwell's parents watched her leave the house with her dog for a quick walk. They never imagined it would be the last time they'd see their daughter alive. Hours later, their worst nightmare came true. Kaylee's body was discovered deep in the woods, brutally attacked. Investigators searched tirelessly, but the killer left no clues, no DNA, no trace. Week by week, the case grew colder, the town sinking deeper into fear. But exactly 1 year later, a hunter testing his thermal drone captured something unexpected in those same woods. That discovery would unravel a chilling trail of secrets and finally expose the identity of a callous killer who had been hiding in plain sight. Kaylee Thornwell was 19 years old, a bright and kind-hearted college student who had returned home for the weekend to spend time with her parents. She was well known in town, not because she sought attention, but because of her warm personality and the way she always smiled when greeting people. Kaylee had grown up in Blue Ridge, playing softball at the local high school and working summers at the ice cream parlor downtown. Everyone who knew her described her as gentle, caring, and impossibly patient, especially with animals. Her golden retriever, Boone, was her constant companion, often following her everywhere. That Saturday afternoon, Kaylee decided to take Boone for a walk on the forest trail just behind her family's cabin. It was a path she had walked hundreds of times before, one she knew so well she could almost navigate it blindfolded. But on that day, she would never come back. It was supposed to be a short walk, the kind Kaylee often took before dinner. Boone's leash was clipped to her hand, and she carried a small backpack with her phone, earbuds, and a water bottle. The sun was still high, and the forest was alive with the sounds of cicadas, birds, and the occasional rustle of deer moving through the undergrowth. Witnesses later remembered seeing her heading toward the trail around 4 p.m., waving to an elderly neighbor who was gardening nearby. That was the last friendly wave she would ever give. Hours later, when Boone returned to the Thornwell cabin alone, limping, his fur matted with blood, panic set in. Kaylee's parents immediately called the police, their voices trembling as they begged for help, knowing in their bones that something was terribly wrong. The search began quickly. Within an hour, sheriff's deputies, neighbors, and volunteers flooded the woods with flashlights, calling out Kaylee's name over and over. Boone barked repeatedly toward the deeper sections of the trail, straining against his leash as if to lead them somewhere. What the searchers found was worse than any nightmare the town could have imagined. Kaylee's body was discovered in a small clearing less than a mile from the trailhead. She had been brutally attacked, her body left in a way that suggested this was not a random act of violence. The scene was horrifying, methodical, calculated, and cruel. Her injuries were not just the result of rage. They suggested precision, as though her killer had taken time to inflict suffering in a deliberate way. Investigators described it later as something they would never forget, the kind of violence that burns into memory forever. News of the murder spread through Blue Ridge like wildfire. By midnight, the entire town knew what had happened. Though the details were whispered in fragments, she was cut up, they found her in the woods. Boone came back alone. Parents clutched their children tightly, locking doors that had been open for years. The Thornwells were inconsolable, collapsing into each other's arms as detectives tried to gather details about Kaylee's last known movements. Neighbors offered food, prayers, and promises, but nothing could touch the raw wound of losing a child in such a monstrous way. For Blue Ridge, innocents had died alongside Kaylee that night. Everyone knew it, and everyone feared what it meant. If someone could do this to her, they could do it again. Within days, the FBI was called in. The brutality of the crime, combined with the lack of immediate suspects, suggested the work of someone organized, possibly even experienced. Agents combed the woods, collecting evidence with forensic teams. Dogs were brought in, searching for scents. Drones scanned from above. Yet for all the resources deployed, the case refused to yield answers. No usable fingerprints were found. No DNA matched anyone in the system, and Kaylee's phone had been smashed and discarded a few yards from her body. Whoever did this had been careful, almost too careful. Investigators began to fear they weren't dealing with an impulsive killer, but with someone who knew how to avoid leaving a trail. Rumors spread quickly in town. Some whispered that the killer was a drifter, someone just passing through the Appalachian trails who had since disappeared into the mountains. Others believed it had to be a local, someone familiar with the woods, someone who knew where to strike without being seen. The most chilling possibility, whispered only in hushed voices, was that this might not have been the first time. Old missing persons posters from nearby counties were suddenly revisited. People began asking questions about hikers who had vanished years before, about women who had gone missing without explanation. The thought that Blue Ridge could be the hunting ground of a serial predator spread terror more quickly than any official announcement could contain. Detective Laura Jensen, the lead investigator from the county sheriff's office, felt the weight of the case pressing down on her more heavily than any in her career. She was seasoned, tough, and known for her dedication, but this case cut her deeper than most. Years earlier, her own teenage daughter had gone missing, never found, swallowed by the silence of an unsolved mystery. Kaylee's murder reignited every old wound, every memory of helplessness. She vowed to herself that she would not let Kaylee's case become another cold file collecting dust. She worked late into the night, reviewing evidence, chasing down every tip, desperate to find the shadowy figure who had destroyed the Thornwell family and shattered the safety of Blue Ridge. But as weeks turned into months, the trail grew colder. Witnesses who claimed to have seen strange figures in the woods could not give reliable descriptions. The one hiker who had been noticed in the days before the murder was never identified. Boone's wounds suggested he had fought back against the attacker, but no usable DNA was recovered from his fur. Every promising lead collapsed into disappointment. The community began to grow restless, angry even, wondering why so much effort had brought so few results. Candlelight vigils turned into frustrated town meetings. People wanted answers, but the answers weren't coming. The FBI eventually scaled back their involvement, classifying the case as inactive but open. It was a bureaucratic way of saying they had no idea what had happened or who was responsible. By the end of summer, the town tried to move forward, though the wound never fully closed. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. People carried flashlights and pepper spray on evening strolls. The once popular hiking trails sat eerily empty, branches reclaiming paths where laughter used to echo. The Thornwell family, broken and hollowed by grief, could not move on. Rachel Thornwell, Kaylee's mother, spent her nights on the computer, poring over true crime forums and emailing detectives, desperate for something to cling to. Mitch Thornwell, her father, drank more and spoke less, retreating into silence as if words could only reopen the bleeding wound of his loss. Detective Jensen checked the case file weekly, unable to let go even when everyone around her urged her to. And the killer? He was gone. Vanished without a trace. The woods of Blue Ridge held their silence, keeping his secret. For now, the murder of Kaylee Thornwell was more than a tragedy. It was a rupture, a violent tear in the fabric of Blue Ridge, Georgia. In the days that followed her death, the entire town moved in slow motion, as if time itself had been stunned. At the center of this grief was Kaylee's family. Rachel Thornwell, her mother, spent her mornings staring blankly at Kaylee's room, refusing to change a single thing inside it. Her father, Mitch, sat for hours on the porch, chain-smoking cigarettes and staring toward the woods, as if willing them to give back what they had taken. Friends of Kaylee flooded the family cabin with casseroles, flowers, and condolences, but no gesture seemed to matter. The house was filled with people, yet unbearably empty. Boone, Kaylee's golden retriever, paced restlessly, whining at the door as though waiting for his girl to walk back in and clip on his leash. The community responded quickly, organizing a candlelight vigil at the high school football field. Hundreds attended, holding flickering candles in silence as Kaylee's photo appeared on a makeshift memorial of flowers, teddy bears, and hand-drawn posters. Classmates stood in circles, crying openly, while teachers tried and failed to comfort them. A local pastor delivered a trembling prayer, urging the town not to give in to fear. But fear was already there, sitting heavy on every shoulder. Parents pulled their children closer, casting nervous glances at the tree line surrounding the field. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. The killer was still out there. Maybe even standing among them in the crowd, blending in like any other grieving face. The thought lingered like smoke, unspoken but undeniable. Detective Laura Jensen stood at the back of the vigil, her hands in her coat pockets, watching quietly. She didn't join the circle of prayer, didn't speak to the media, didn't even step near the Thornwell family that night. Instead, she scanned the faces, memorizing the expressions. Every investigator knows that killers sometimes return to the scene, that they crave the attention, the chaos, the proximity to their crime. Jensen's eyes swept across the crowd like a searchlight, looking for someone whose grief seemed rehearsed or absent. She found nothing concrete, only a wall of sadness and fear. But she felt something in her gut, a tightness she couldn't shake. The kind of feeling that comes when the truth is close but hiding. It was the same feeling she had lived with since her own daughter vanished years before. A constant, gnawing whisper, "Don't let go." Rachel Thornwell, desperate for answers, began throwing herself into her own search almost immediately. Unable to bear the quiet of the cabin, she spent nights scouring the internet for information about similar murders. She joined online true crime forums, shared details of Kaylee's case with strangers, and begged anyone for advice. Some responded with kindness, offering sympathy or theories. Others were cruel, accusing her of exaggerating or even suggesting that the family might be hiding something. Mitch, unable to cope with Rachel's late-night obsession, withdrew further. He started spending long hours at a bar on the edge of town, drowning his sorrow in whiskey. Their marriage strained under the weight of grief, each parent trapped in their own cycle of suffering. Boone often lay at the edge of Kaylee's bed, refusing to eat until Rachel coaxed him. The house that once rang with laughter now echoed only with silence. The official investigation stalled quickly. FBI agents, after weeks of combing the woods and analyzing evidence, admitted privately to local authorities that they were at a dead end. The brutality of the crime suggested experience, maybe even serial behavior, but there was nothing to tie it to a specific person. The one possible lead, a hiker spotted days before the murder, produced no identification. Without DNA, fingerprints, or surveillance footage, the case had nowhere to go. By the third month, FBI resources were reduced, leaving Detective Jensen and her team to manage what remained. This only deepened the frustration in Blue Ridge. To the townspeople, it felt like abandonment. To Jensen, it felt like betrayal. She knew cases like this didn't just disappear. They were buried by time, bureaucracy, and fading attention. With no answers, Blue Ridge began to turn inward. Rumors spread like wildfire, filling the void left by silence. Some residents believed the killer was a stranger, someone passing through who had long since moved on. Others suspected it had to be someone local, someone who knew the trails as well as Kaylee did. Whispers grew darker. Maybe it was ritualistic, maybe cult-related, maybe even tied to old Appalachian legends of shadowy figures that stalked the woods. Teenagers dared each other to walk the trail at night, recording shaky videos for social media, while parents banned their kids from going anywhere alone. The once bustling hiking community vanished overnight. Trailheads that had been filled with cars on sunny weekends sat empty, weeds creeping across gravel. The silence of the woods became unbearable, as if the trees themselves were holding back a secret. Detective Jensen kept pressing forward, though she felt the case slipping from her hands. She spent nights at her office, poring over the same evidence again and again, hoping something new would stand out. Boone often lay curled at her feet, his soft snoring the only comfort in the otherwise cold silence of the station. Jensen carried her own grief like a shadow. Her daughter's unsolved disappearance haunted every decision, every failure. Kaylee's case was more than professional, it was personal. Each photo of Kaylee's smiling face reminded her of her own child, frozen forever at 16, never given the chance to grow older. She couldn't let Kaylee become another forgotten file. She refused. Yet every lead seemed to dissolve in her hands, leaving her staring into the same void she had known before. The Thornwells struggled not only with their grief, but also with the growing attention of the media. News vans parked near their cabin, reporters knocking on their door, asking invasive questions. Rachel sometimes lashed out, demanding they leave her family alone, while Mitch avoided them entirely. National outlets painted Kaylee as the Blue Ridge victim, a tragic headline that stripped her of her full humanity. The community felt exploited, used as a backdrop for horror stories. Some locals grew hostile toward outsiders, believing journalists were more interested in spectacle than truth. The once friendly town grew colder, more suspicious. Every stranger was a potential suspect, every unfamiliar car on the street a reason to worry. Blue Ridge was no longer the safe, sleepy mountain town it had been. It had been reborn as a place of fear. One overlooked piece of the story came from a man named Matt Delaney, a lifelong hunter who knew the woods better than most. A few weeks after Kaylee's murder, he had reported something unusual. Late one night, while setting up cameras to track deer movement, he had heard a scream in the distance. Not the scream of an animal, but something human. He also captured a strange thermal image with his handheld device, showing heat signatures in an area where no one should have been. The report was filed but ultimately dismissed, categorized as inconclusive. With no corroborating evidence and no missing person tied to that time frame, investigators moved on. But Matt didn't forget. He knew the woods, knew their rhythms, and something about that night unsettled him. He was convinced the forest still held secrets, and that someone was out there watching. As autumn faded into winter, the town tried to adapt, though the air remained heavy with unease. Rachel Thornwell clung to her online research, convinced that similar cases were connected. Mitch sank further into silence. Boone became protective, growling at shadows near the window. Detective Jensen's team faced pressure from higher-ups to let the case rest, but she refused, insisting on keeping it open even if only as a formality. "There's something missing," she told colleagues again and again. "He's out there. He's not done." But without new evidence, her words sounded more like desperation than conviction. Blue Ridge drifted between fear and exhaustion, suspended in limbo. The story of Kaylee Thornwell wasn't over. Deep in the Appalachian woods, someone waited. And though no one knew it yet, the silence would soon be broken by a discovery that would change everything. The first year after Kaylee Thornwell's murder passed slowly in Blue Ridge, but it never truly passed for those closest to her. Time felt broken, as if the town itself was stuck in the moment they lost her. By the following spring, the trail where she had last walked with Boone was nearly swallowed by the forest. Fallen trees blocked the path, weeds crept over the dirt, and the once cheerful trailhead sign leaned sideways, forgotten. Where families once hiked and children once played, silence reigned. To the townspeople, those woods were cursed, and no one wanted to go near them. The trail had transformed into a scar, a reminder carved into the land itself of what had been taken. Even the bravest avoided it. When the wind swept through the branches, some swore it carried echoes of a young woman's voice crying for help. Detective Laura Jensen never allowed herself to step back from the case, no matter how much her superiors hinted that she should. Other detectives moved on, other cases demanded attention, but Kaylee's file never left Jensen's desk. She was known within the sheriff's department as the one who wouldn't let go, a label spoken half in respect and half in frustration. Each week, she reopened the file, reviewing photographs, timelines, and witness statements until she could recite them from memory. She refused to let Kaylee's case be shoved into storage as another unsolved statistic. To Jensen, this wasn't just work, it was personal, a war against the kind of loss she had lived with when her own daughter vanished years before. She would not repeat that mistake. Kaylee deserved justice, and she would hold on to that promise until her last day on the job. The Thornwell family was not able to hold together under the weight of their grief. Rachel, Kaylee's mother, left Blue Ridge less than a year after the murder. The constant reminders, the woods behind the cabin, the empty bedroom, the neighbors' sympathetic eyes, were too much to bear. She moved to Florida to live with her sister, but her heart remained in Georgia. From there, she poured her energy into an online blog about her daughter's case, trying to raise awareness and connect with other families who had lost loved ones to violent crime. Her posts were raw, filled with grief and determination, and they gained a following in online true crime communities. Mitch Thornwell, Kaylee's father, reacted differently. He sold their family cabin and retreated into a small apartment in town. He drank heavily, often avoiding people altogether. Their marriage, once steady, unraveled under the strain. The killer hadn't just taken Kaylee's life. He had destroyed everything her parents knew. Blue Ridge itself carried the weight of the crime like a stone in its chest. The town's image as a safe, picturesque getaway had been shattered. Tourism plummeted. Trailheads once crowded with hikers sat empty, grass overtaking gravel parking lots. Local businesses suffered, unable to draw the crowds they once had. Residents became suspicious, jumpy, and distant. Parents who once allowed their children to walk freely through the streets now demanded curfews. Women rarely walked alone, even during daylight hours. The woods, once the pride of the town, now loomed as a reminder of horror. Conversations in grocery stores or gas stations often circled back to Kaylee's case, each one ending with the same heavy sigh: they never caught him. The absence of closure festered like an open wound. Blue Ridge was no longer just a quiet mountain town. It was a town haunted. For Kaylee's friends, moving forward without her was painful. They went off to college or took jobs elsewhere, but their milestones, birthdays, graduations, new relationships, always felt incomplete. At gatherings, there was always a moment where her name hovered in the air, too heavy to say out loud. Her best friend Megan carried the deepest guilt, constantly replaying the thought that she should have joined Kaylee that day. "If I had been there," she confided to Jensen once, "maybe she wouldn't have been alone." No words of comfort could erase that feeling. Kaylee's absence was a presence in itself, lingering at the edge of every reunion, every wedding, every holiday. The group had grown older, but Kaylee would never grow with them. That knowledge was an invisible chain around their hearts. Detective Jensen made it a point to visit Kaylee's grave once a month. It was not part of her job, but she considered it part of her duty. She brought Boone with her each time, the loyal golden retriever who had survived that night. Boone would sit quietly at the headstone, sniffing the flowers others left behind, then lift his gaze toward the woods in the distance. Jensen often spoke aloud at the grave, telling Kaylee about updates in the investigation, about her parents, even about Boone's progress. Sometimes she whispered apologies, other times promises. She refused to let the silence consume the memory of this young woman. To Jensen, the grave was not just a place of mourning, it was a reminder of her oath. "I haven't forgotten," she whispered each time before she left. "I'll never stop." Boone would tug at the leash then, pulling toward the forest, as if he too knew justice was waiting out there. Meanwhile, rumors and myths about the case grew like vines. With no answers and no arrest, stories filled the vacuum. Teenagers spoke of a shadow man who stalked the woods at night, daring each other to film themselves near the trail. Shaky videos popped up online, showing dark shapes in the trees or eerie noises, though none were ever verified. Older residents spoke of strangers passing through, eyes that lingered too long, cars parked in unusual places. Some believed the killer had moved on to another state, blending into the vast Appalachian Trail system. Others were certain he was still nearby, hiding in plain sight. The lack of resolution blurred the line between fact and folklore until fear became part of Blue Ridge's identity. Even the most rational among them couldn't help but wonder when the shadow would strike again. Despite the pressure to let it go, Jensen kept Kaylee's case technically active. She argued at department meetings, often clashing with her superiors, insisting that no one should assume the killer was gone. "He's still out there," she repeated like a mantra. "And he's not done." Some colleagues rolled their eyes, others offered quiet support, but Jensen's persistence ensured that the case file was never fully closed. She followed up on every tip, no matter how unlikely. She used her access to new forensic databases, hoping technology would finally catch what human investigation had missed. Though progress was non-existent, she refused to admit defeat. She remembered too well what it had felt like when her daughter's case had been marked cold. She couldn't let Kaylee's fate become another unsolved headline. The silence was unbearable, but she would endure it as long as it took. Boone, though older and slower than he had been a year earlier, remained a symbol of the case itself. His limp never fully healed, and he bore scars from that night in the woods, but his loyalty never wavered. At home with Jensen, he was calm, gentle, and affectionate. But whenever they passed the forest edge, his body stiffened. His ears perked, his teeth bared, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Neighbors noticed, whispering that Boone remembered something humans could not. Some believed he carried the memory of Kaylee's last moments, etched into his instincts. To Jensen, Boone was not just a pet. He was a living piece of evidence, a constant reminder that the killer had been real, tangible, and close. Whenever she stroked his fur, she reminded herself that Boone's survival was proof. There was still a thread to follow. Blue Ridge tried to live with its grief, but living with it was not the same as healing. Parents continued their routines, children went back to school, and businesses kept their doors open, but the shadow never lifted. Kaylee's story became a warning whispered to newcomers, a reminder of what could happen in even the quietest of towns. For outsiders, Blue Ridge was a sad headline, another statistic in America's long list of unsolved murders. But for those who lived there, it was an open wound. They pretended to move forward, but the truth remained: the killer was still out there. And though no one could see him, Detective Laura Jensen knew in her bones that silence was temporary. The forest was holding its breath, waiting. Someone would break that silence again. The first anniversary of Kaylee Thornwell's death came and went with heavy silence in Blue Ridge. There were no big vigils, no news crews this time, only quiet acknowledgments whispered at the grocery store or during Sunday service. The Thornwell family was scattered now, and Detective Laura Jensen continued her dogged pursuit of leads, though every file she opened seemed to end in disappointment. Life had grown heavy with routine, each day marked by the same unanswered questions. The trail where Kaylee died sat abandoned, the weeds taller now, the wood sign falling further into decay. Boone still growled at the forest edge each time Jensen walked him near it, but she had come to accept his warnings as part of their life together. It was as though the town had resigned itself to living in a shadow. Then, out of nowhere, the silence cracked, not with words, but with an image captured from above. Matt Delaney had lived in Blue Ridge his entire life. A hunter since his teenage years, he knew the mountains like the back of his hand. For years, he had set up trail cameras and spent long weekends alone in the woods, tracking deer patterns and studying migration routes. In the months after Kaylee's death, he had avoided those woods, unable to shake the memory of the night he'd heard a scream and seen something strange on his handheld thermal scanner. His report had been dismissed as inconclusive, but he had never forgotten it. Now, a year later, technology had advanced. Matt had invested in a high-grade thermal drone, equipped with a mounted camera capable of scanning vast sections of forest at night. What began as another ordinary hunting trip quickly became something far more chilling. The drone picked up heat, but not from wildlife. Hovering above an abandoned stretch of forest 2 miles from where Kaylee had been killed, the drone's thermal lens detected a human-shaped figure moving slowly through the darkness. At first, Matt assumed it was another hunter, but the movements were wrong. The figure stayed low, almost crouching, weaving between trees with deliberate care, pausing as if listening. Then, as the drone shifted, another detail appeared, a faint, square outline beneath the trees, colder than the ground around it. It looked like a structure, maybe an old cabin long hidden by the overgrowth. Matt adjusted the drone and zoomed in. The figure stopped moving and looked upward. For a split second, glowing white eyes on the thermal feed seemed to stare directly at the drone. The screen flickered, static breaking across the image, before the figure vanished into the shadows. Matt's skin crawled. He knew instantly this was no coincidence. He had found something connected to Kaylee. The next morning, Matt packed his truck with gear and set out toward the location his drone had marked. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, amplifying every snap of a twig. After an hour of hiking, he found it. Hidden under thick vines and collapsed branches stood the rotting frame of a cabin, its windows black holes, its roof half collapsed. The ground around it was disturbed, as though someone had been digging or dragging heavy objects. Matt's stomach turned as he stepped closer, noticing a foul smell that seemed to seep from the earth itself. Scattered near the cabin were fragments of cloth, leather, and bone. He froze, realizing some of it was human. One shoe lay half buried in the dirt, faded and worn, but still identifiable. It matched the description of the one Kaylee had been wearing when she died. Matt backed away, his hands shaking. This was no coincidence. He had stumbled onto a graveyard. Matt didn't waste time. He drove straight to the sheriff's office and demanded to see Detective Jensen. She sat across from him, her brow furrowed as he laid out the thermal footage, the coordinates, and his findings at the cabin site. Jensen's heartbeat quickened as she watched the white heat signature moving through the trees on his screen. It was proof, real, tangible proof, that someone had been out there, someone alive, someone hiding. The shoe, the bones, the disturbed ground. This was more than coincidence. "You just reopened Kaylee's case," Jensen said quietly, her eyes sharp. For the first time in months, she felt the spark of hope, the fire of pursuit reigniting in her chest. She ordered a team to prepare immediately. Within hours, deputies, FBI agents, and forensic units were mobilizing toward the site Matt had discovered. The cabin and its surroundings quickly became the center of a massive investigation. Yellow tape went up, tents were erected, and crime scene teams worked methodically through the day and into the night. Cadaver dogs alerted to multiple spots around the cabin, digging teams carefully unearthing remains from shallow graves. Some bones were fresh, others old, brittle from years underground. Clothing, jewelry, and scraps of personal items were collected, cataloged, and tagged. The smell of decay lingered in the air, forcing investigators to wear masks. But the discovery that chilled everyone the most was the shoe Matt had seen. Forensic analysts confirmed it matched the pair Kaylee had owned, the missing one she never came home with. Rachel Thornwell was called and notified. Her sobs echoed through the phone line. It was another cruel reminder of what they had lost, but also confirmation that the case wasn't dead. Someone had left Kaylee there, and someone had been back. Inside the cabin, the horror deepened. Forensics uncovered scraps of burned photographs, fragments of clothing deliberately slashed, and crude carvings on the wooden walls. One symbol repeated over and over, scratched deep into the timber, a circle intersected by lines, resembling both a target and a ritual mark. Beneath the floorboards, investigators found a hidden compartment, inside of which lay several objects wrapped in plastic. They were trophies, necklaces, ID cards, and personal belongings that didn't belong to Kaylee but to other missing women. Each item was tagged, bagged, and taken into evidence. When the news broke, Blue Ridge exploded in fear and outrage. The rumors were true. Kaylee wasn't the only victim. Their town had been the hunting ground of a predator who had vanished, only to leave behind a shrine of his cruelty. Detective Jensen stood outside the cabin, the weight of the discovery pressing heavily on her shoulders. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the crime scene. She felt both vindicated and sickened. Her instincts had been right all along. The killer hadn't disappeared. He had been here, moving through the woods, unseen but present. The evidence suggested careful planning, survival skills, and patience. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a campaign. As she looked at the bags of belongings being carried out of the cabin, her jaw tightened. She thought of Rachel Thornwell in Florida, waiting by the phone for updates, of Mitch drowning in silence, of Kaylee's friends trying to live with the hole left in their lives. This discovery wasn't closure. It was the beginning of something larger. The silence had ended, but the answers ahead might be worse than the questions. That night, Jensen couldn't sleep. Boone paced restlessly around her home, ears perked, growling at the faint noises outside. She sat at her kitchen table, Matt's drone footage replaying again and again on her laptop. The heat signature, the human figure, moved deliberately, then stared upward, as if it knew it was being watched. The thought unsettled her. This wasn't just a fugitive hiding in the woods. It was someone who understood surveillance, someone aware enough to sense a drone in the sky. When she froze the video at the moment the figure looked up, her skin prickled. Even through the grainy thermal filter, she swore the outline of a face glared back, as if mocking her. She knew then that this discovery wasn't just luck. It was a challenge. The killer had slipped away before, but now the hunt had started again. And this time, Jensen vowed, she would not let him vanish. By the end of the week, the FBI confirmed at least 3 separate sets of remains found near the cabin belonged to missing women from nearby counties. Kaylee was one of them, but others had been missing for years. The case officially transformed from a single brutal homicide into a confirmed serial investigation. Blue Ridge, once reluctant to even whisper about the possibility, now faced the horrifying truth. Their town had been stalked by a serial killer who had used their forest as a dumping ground. National media descended again, headlines screaming about the Blue Ridge Butcher. Some residents resented the intrusion, others welcomed it, hoping pressure would finally bring results. Detective Jensen ignored the cameras. Her focus was on the evidence, on the figure in the drone footage, and on the chilling knowledge that someone had been there, alive watching, just days earlier. The silence of the woods had ended. The hunt was on. The discovery of the cabin and the remains buried around it electrified law enforcement. What had once been a frustrating dead-end case was now transformed into one of the most urgent investigations in the country. Within days, the FBI assigned a dedicated cold case task force to Blue Ridge. Specialists arrived from Quantico, behavioral profilers, forensic anthropologists, and analysts skilled in linking unsolved cases across state lines. The local sheriff's office turned into a hive of activity, walls covered in maps, photographs, and timelines. Reporters swarmed outside, but inside, the focus was singular. Who had committed these murders, and where was he now? At the center of it all stood Detective Laura Jensen, no longer the outlier fighting to keep Kaylee Thornwell's case alive, but the lead voice of a massive investigation. For the first time in years, she had resources, allies, and momentum. But the weight of responsibility pressed hard against her. The first task was to identify the remains recovered from the cabin site. Forensic teams worked around the clock, cataloging bones, scraps of clothing, and personal effects. Dental records confirmed 3 victims within a week. Kaylee Thornwell, a nurse's aide named Samantha Porter who had vanished in 2018, and a college student named Jordan Avery missing since 2019. Other remains were more fragmented, requiring DNA testing, but early signs suggested at least 2 more victims. The discovery sent shockwaves through the families of the missing, reopening wounds they had tried desperately to close. Some came to Blue Ridge to see the site themselves, standing at the edge of the forest in silent grief. Others lashed out at law enforcement, demanding to know why it had taken so long. Jensen bore their anger with quiet resolve, knowing she had asked herself the same questions for years. As evidence piled up, the FBI's behavioral analysts crafted a chilling profile of the killer. The precision of the injuries, the organized method of disposal, and the survivalist use of the cabin all pointed to someone highly skilled and disciplined. The team believed he was male, likely in his late 30s to early 40s, with military or medical training. His ability to avoid leaving trace evidence suggested he understood investigative techniques, maybe even had law enforcement exposure. The trophies collected inside the cabin, IDs, jewelry, and personal keepsakes, were classic hallmarks of a serial predator who needed reminders of his victims. But the most disturbing detail of the profile was the timeline. The killer had struck every 1 to 2 years, methodically, with cooling-off periods in between. Kaylee had been his most recent known victim, but if the pattern held true, He was due to kill again. That thought left the task force racing against time. Detective Jensen immersed herself in the work, but the case consumed her in ways that were both professional and personal. Each photograph of Kaylee reopened the wound of her own daughter's disappearance, a scar she had carried for years. At night, she lay awake, replaying the drone footage of the heat signature moving through the woods. She imagined what it would feel like to stand across from the man responsible, to look into his eyes and see what kind of darkness could commit such acts. Boone lay at her feet, restless, often growling in his sleep, as though he too dreamed of the night in the woods. Jensen poured coffee after coffee, refusing to slow down. This was her chance to do what she hadn't been able to do before, bring a predator to justice. But the pressure weighed heavily, threatening to break her before she could break the case. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a small metal tag found in the ashes of the cabin's fireplace. At first it appeared to be trash, warped and charred from heat. But when analysts cleaned it, the numbers stamped into the surface became legible. It was an identification tag from a hospital, once worn by employees on lanyards. Further research revealed it belonged to a nurse's aide who had vanished 6 years earlier from a town in Tennessee, more than 100 miles away. That case had been long forgotten, filed as a likely runaway, but now it was clear she had been another victim. The connection widened the investigation's scope. This was no local killer. He had hunted across state lines, moving silently from community to community, leaving devastation in his wake. The revelation turned the case from a regional nightmare into a federal priority. The Blue Ridge Killer wasn't just theirs anymore. He belonged to the country. The task force began combing through unsolved cases across Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, searching for patterns that matched the killer's methods. Dozens of files poured in: missing women, hikers gone without a trace, cold cases marked insufficient evidence. Many bore striking similarities: victims found in wooded areas, possessions missing, traces of surgical-like wounds. As the net widened, the number of potential victims grew. It became clear that Kaylee was far from the beginning of the story. She was part of a series, one chapter in a book of horrors that stretched back years. The realization was crushing for families who had prayed their loved ones' cases would one day bring answers. Now the answer was staring them in the face. Their daughters, sisters, and friends had fallen into the same hands as Kaylee. And the man responsible was still free. For Jensen, the investigation reopened not only Kaylee's wounds, but also the memories of her own daughter's disappearance. She had never spoken much about it to her colleagues, but in the quiet of her office, she admitted to herself that this case felt like destiny. It was as if the universe had given her another chance, to save someone else's daughter where she had failed to save her own. But that kind of weight was crushing. She pushed herself harder, skipping meals, sleeping only in short bursts, driven by obsession. Her colleagues noticed. Some worried she was pushing past her limits. But Jensen brushed them off. "If I don't push, who will?" she snapped once during a late-night briefing. Everyone fell silent. They knew she wasn't wrong. Her determination had kept this case alive long enough to reach this point. Without her, Kaylee would have been forgotten. Without her, they might never have found the cabin. Despite the progress, the killer himself remained a ghost. The thermal drone footage was their only visual lead, and it offered no clear facial features. Still, analysts enhanced the video frame by frame, searching for clues. His height, build, and gait were estimated, suggesting a man in strong physical condition, accustomed to moving quietly through terrain. The way he looked upward at the drone suggested awareness, maybe even training. It wasn't random movement, it was tactical. Jensen watched the footage over and over, studying the way he shifted his weight, the angle of his head. Something about it tugged at her memory. She had interviewed hundreds of men over the years, but there was one in particular, a former Army medic named Daniel Cross, who had stood out after Kaylee's murder. He had lived briefly on the edge of town before disappearing suddenly. At the time, there had been no evidence to hold him. But Jensen had never stopped thinking about him. When Jensen raised Daniel Cross's name at a task force meeting, some of her colleagues were skeptical. "It's been a year," one agent said. "If he was guilty, wouldn't we have found something by now?" But Jensen argued that his background fit the profile perfectly. He had medical training, survival experience, and a dishonorable discharge from the military after an incident that was never fully explained. He had vanished after Kaylee's death, leaving behind a rented trailer with no forwarding address. "He didn't just leave," Jensen said firmly. "He disappeared. There's a difference." The task force agreed to re-examine Cross's file, pulling military records, financial statements, and past addresses. The deeper they dug, the more troubling the picture became. Cross had been connected to several small towns near other unsolved disappearances. He had lived like a ghost, moving often, leaving little behind. The suspicion that had once been a hunch was hardening into something more. The emotional toll on Jensen grew heavier as the investigation spread. Families of the victims called her day and night, begging for updates, crying over the phone, demanding answers. She listened patiently, offering what little comfort she could, though each call left her drained. At night, she sat in her living room with Boone curled beside her, staring at the photos on her wall. Kaylee, Samantha, Jordan, and the others. She whispered their names aloud, as if reciting a prayer. "We'll find him," she promised the silent faces. "We'll bring him in." But deep down, a small voice gnawed at her. What if they were too late? What if he had already chosen his next victim? The thought of another family living through the same nightmare kept her awake long after the house had gone quiet. Then, just as the task force seemed to be piecing the puzzle together, the nightmare struck again. In a neighboring town less than 30 miles from Blue Ridge, a young woman vanished while hiking a popular trail. Her car was found at the trailhead, her belongings still inside, but she was gone. Search teams scoured the forest for days with no results. The similarities to Kaylee's case were unmistakable. The task force had been right. The killer wasn't finished. He had waited a year, just as the profile suggested, and struck again. For Jensen, the news was like a punch to the gut. She had worked tirelessly to prevent another murder, and yet here it was. The sense of failure burned, but beneath it was a sharper determination. Now they knew he was active again. Now the hunt had a deadline. And this time, she vowed, they would not let him slip away. The disappearance of another young woman ignited the investigation with new urgency. For Detective Laura Jensen, it was a crushing reminder that the killer had not slowed down, not vanished, not weakened. He was still here, still stalking, still choosing. The task force doubled its efforts, combing the Blue Ridge forests and surrounding areas with renewed focus. Drones scanned from above, cadaver dogs worked the ground, and agents pressed locals for anything unusual. It was during one of these sweeps, just a few miles beyond the abandoned cabin, that a team stumbled upon something extraordinary. Hidden beneath a collapsed hunting blind, partially buried under leaves and earth, was a steel trapdoor. It was heavy, rusted, and secured with a padlock that had corroded with time. When investigators forced it open, the stench that rose out nearly drove them back. Flashlights pierced the darkness below, revealing a set of stairs. The killer hadn't just used the cabin. He had built a bunker. The descent into the underground space was harrowing. The air was thick, damp, and foul, carrying the unmistakable odor of decay mixed with mildew. As agents moved cautiously down the narrow steps, their lights revealed walls reinforced with wood and sheet metal, signs of careful construction. At the bottom was a low-ceilinged room, its walls scrawled with crude symbols like those carved into the cabin above. Journals, dozens of them, lay stacked on a makeshift table. Each one was filled with obsessive, meticulous handwriting, describing the victims in chilling detail, their habits, their final moments, and the killer's thoughts as he ended their lives. There were photographs too, some taken from a distance as the victims lived their daily lives, others more graphic, documenting their suffering. It was a shrine to cruelty, a place built not just to hide but to revel in horror. For Jensen, it was almost too much to bear. Yet she forced herself to keep looking. The bunker revealed something else, evidence that the killer had not acted alone, at least not always. Among the journals were entries written in two distinct handwritings. Some pages detailed surveillance notes, times and places where women had been spotted alone. Others described preparations and deliveries. One entry, written months before Kaylee's murder, referenced our bringing food and supplies. Investigators seized on the clue, wondering if R was a local accomplice who had aided the killer in hiding or sustaining his secret life. Fingerprint analysis later confirmed that someone besides the killer had touched items in the bunker. This discovery shook the task force. The idea of a single predator was terrifying enough, but the possibility that he had helped, that others in the community had known or even enabled him, was horrifying. It raised questions that went beyond the killer himself. How deep did this darkness run? As evidence was processed, the name Daniel Cross surfaced again and again. His military background, his sudden disappearance after Kaylee's death, his history of moving through towns near other unsolved cases, all of it fit the growing puzzle. His dishonorable discharge had been linked to a suspicious incident overseas, where a patient under his care died from what appeared to be deliberate neglect. Military records hinted at psychological instability, but the details were redacted. Cross had returned to the U.S. under a cloud of suspicion, moving through rural areas, taking odd jobs, never staying long. In Blue Ridge, he had worked briefly as a maintenance man at a local animal shelter, a chilling detail, considering Boone's injuries the night Kaylee died. Witnesses recalled him as quiet, polite even, but distant. When investigators searched national databases, they discovered his last known residence was abandoned, his belongings burned in a fire that appeared intentional. It was as if he had erased himself. Jensen found herself consumed by the journals taken from the bunker. She read late into the night, each word searing itself into her mind. The killer described Kaylee with clinical detachment, noting her predictable routine of walking Boone each evening. He wrote about watching her for weeks, memorizing her habits, studying her gait, her posture, her smile. The detail was nauseating, a violation even in death. But what broke Jensen was the entry describing the night itself. He wrote about the way Boone had fought back, the scratches on his arms, the beautiful resistance of a girl who refused to go quietly. Jensen slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling with rage. This wasn't just a killer. This was a man who took pride in suffering, who considered his crimes not mistakes but achievements. Reading his words, Jensen felt the depth of his darkness more acutely than ever before, and she knew he wasn't finished. The bunker also revealed another layer of betrayal, potential corruption within law enforcement itself. Among the files stuffed into a metal cabinet was a set of police reports, marked confidential, from the early days of Kaylee's case. They were drafts, never filed into the official system. One report included a witness statement from a man who claimed he had seen a suspicious vehicle near the Thornwell cabin the day of the murder. The license plate had been written down, but the lead was never pursued. Further investigation revealed why. The vehicle belonged to a retired sheriff's deputy, long deceased. It appeared that he had been close to Daniel Cross, possibly even shielding him during his time in Blue Ridge. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or complicity, the deputy had suppressed key evidence that might have stopped the killer sooner. The revelation stung. The community hadn't just been failed by circumstance. It had been failed by those meant to protect it. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. News spread quickly through Blue Ridge and beyond. There was a bunker, journals, evidence of accomplices, and even potential corruption. Kaylee's mother Rachel called Jensen in tears, her voice breaking as she asked why no one had seen it sooner. They could have saved her, Rachel sobbed. If they had done their jobs, she'd still be here. Jensen listened silently, her own throat tight. She knew Rachel was right, at least partly. Failures had piled up, decisions had been made, and now the truth was only emerging when it was too late. The pain rippled outward, touching not just the families but the entire community. Blue Ridge had believed Kaylee's murder was a single horrifying crime. Now they realized it was only the surface of something far larger, something that had been festering in their woods for years. The psychological toll on Jensen grew heavier with each discovery. She saw echoes of her own daughter in the victims' photos, in their journals, in the hollow spaces they had left behind. At night, she dreamed of the bunker, of the journals whispering in the dark, of Kaylee's face flickering between her daughters. Boone often woke her with sharp barks, sensing her unrest. Still, she pushed forward, refusing to let exhaustion slow her. She believed more strongly than ever that Daniel Cross was their man. Every page of every journal pointed to someone with his background. Every detail fit. But he was still out there, moving silently, waiting. The thought gnawed at her. Somewhere in those mountains, he could be watching, listening, maybe even planning his next move. The task force felt the same urgency. They had uncovered the truth, but exposing it meant nothing until they had him in custody. Then came the revelation that shattered the illusion of distance. One of the journals contained photographs that chilled Jensen to her core. They weren't of Kaylee or the other confirmed victims. They were of women still alive, recent photos, taken from a distance. At a grocery store, walking into a library, leaving a church. Some were time-stamped only weeks earlier. The killer wasn't reminiscing about the past. He was scouting for the future. The implication was horrifying. He had already chosen new targets. The hunt wasn't just about solving past murders anymore. It was about preventing the next. For Jensen, the realization lit a fire inside her. This wasn't just about Kaylee anymore. It was about stopping a cycle that could claim countless others. The past was horrific, but the future was still unwritten. And if she had anything to say about it, Daniel Cross would never add another page to his journals. The community reeled as the revelations poured out, each one darker than the last. Families gathered in the town hall, demanding answers from law enforcement. Some wept openly, others shouted in anger. The fear that had hovered for a year solidified into outrage. How had the killer gone unnoticed? How had accomplices existed in their town? How had law enforcement failed to pursue leads that were now so obvious? Detective Jensen stood before them, weary but resolute. "We can't change the past," she told the crowd. "But we can stop him now. We will stop him." Her words carried weight, though not everyone was convinced. The trust between the community and law enforcement was fractured, maybe permanently. But as the crowd slowly dispersed, some found comfort in her determination. They needed someone to believe in, and for all her scars, Jensen was still standing. Late one night, as Jensen studied the photographs again, Boone lifted his head and growled. It was a low, deep sound, the kind he only made when he sensed something wrong. Jensen froze, listening. A branch snapped outside. Her heart raced as she grabbed her flashlight and moved to the window. The woods beyond her yard were still, silent. She saw nothing. But Boone didn't stop growling. He stood at the door, muscles tense, teeth bared, eyes locked on the tree-line. Jensen's skin prickled. Was it just an animal wandering close, or was the hunter himself watching her now? She shut the blinds, locked the doors, and sat back down at the table, Boone at her side. She had read the journals. She knew his patterns. The killer liked to watch. He liked to study. And the thought that he might now be studying her only strengthened her resolve. The game had shifted. The shadow was drawing closer. The evidence pulled from the bunker gave investigators what they had been missing for more than a year: direction. Fingerprints, handwriting, and DNA all painted a clear picture. Lab results confirmed what Detective Laura Jensen had suspected for months. Daniel Cross was the man behind the Blue Ridge murders. His DNA matched samples lifted from bone fragments and blood-stained cloth inside the underground chamber. The journals contained details only the killer could have known, including a chilling description of Kaylee Thornwell's last walk with Boone. The case against him was airtight on paper, but capturing him was another matter entirely. Cross had been off the grid for nearly 2 years, living like a ghost. He moved often, left no paper trail, and avoided digital footprints. It was as though he had trained his entire life for this kind of vanishing act. Now, the hunt wasn't about if he was guilty, it was about where he was hiding. The task force combed through every shred of information, piecing together Cross's movements. Credit card records were non-existent. Bank accounts had been closed years earlier. But Jensen noticed a pattern in the missing persons cases linked to him. Each had occurred within 50 miles of the Appalachian Trail. Cross seemed to favor rural areas where hikers passed through, places that gave him both cover and opportunity. Surveillance footage from a gas station 2 towns over provided the first break. A grainy clip showed a man with Cross's build purchasing supplies, canned food, water, and camping gear. He wore a hat pulled low, sunglasses masking his eyes, but Jensen recognized the posture instantly. She froze the frame, her pulse quickening. "That's him," she whispered. No one else was convinced at first, but Jensen knew. She had studied him too long not to. The hunt narrowed, and with it came both hope and dread. As the task force closed in, Jensen prepared herself for what she knew was coming: confrontation. She had imagined it countless times, lying awake at night, picturing his face, hearing his words. She wanted to see his eyes, to know what kind of man could orchestrate so much pain and then vanish without remorse. Yet the thought also terrified her. What if he slipped away again? What if he mocked them all by escaping, leaving another family to suffer? The weight of every victim pressed on her shoulders. Kaylee's smile, frozen forever in photographs, haunted her every step. Boone seemed to sense her tension. He paced the floor at night, growling softly when she sat alone with the files. Jensen stroked his head, whispering promises. "We'll get him, boy. I swear we'll get him." Her resolve hardened. She wouldn't let the killer win again. Not this time. The breakthrough came with a tip from a forest ranger in North Carolina. While patrolling a remote section of the Appalachian Trail, he had stumbled upon a makeshift campsite hidden deep in the woods. The site was abandoned, but it bore signs of recent use: ashes still warm in the fire pit, food wrappers scattered, and a crude shelter made from tarps and branches. Among the items left behind was a hunting knife, its blade stained with blood. Lab tests confirmed it wasn't animal blood. It belonged to the most recent missing woman. The discovery sent chills through the task force. Cross had been there. He was still close. A perimeter was established, drones were launched, and search teams moved in. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. They weren't just searching the forest. They were stepping into the killer's territory, a place he knew far better than they did. After 2 tense days of searching, a drone picked up movement near an old logging road. The thermal feed showed a figure matching Cross's size, moving swiftly through the undergrowth. Agents converged, cutting off possible escape routes, while Jensen positioned herself at the command center, her eyes fixed on the monitors. The figure ducked into a hollow, disappeared for a moment, then re-emerged, carrying a pack. He looked up once, and even through the drone's thermal filter, his face was unmistakable. Daniel Cross. Jensen's breath caught in her throat. The chase was on. Tactical teams moved in, carefully closing the distance. But Cross wasn't running blindly. He moved with precision, slipping through shadows, using the terrain to his advantage. It was a dance he had practiced for years, and he was nearly perfect at it. Nearly. This time, he was outnumbered. The standoff happened near dusk, in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Agents had boxed Cross in, rifles raised, voices booming through the forest. "Daniel Cross, put your hands where we can see them." For a moment, silence. Then he stepped forward, calm, collected, almost smiling. His hands rose slowly, the pack sliding off his shoulders. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice carrying in the still air. The words sent a chill down Jensen's spine as she listened from the radio feed. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't panicked. He was entertained. Cross allowed himself to be restrained, his eyes scanning the agents with unnerving composure. When his gaze met the drone camera hovering above, he smirked. To him, this wasn't defeat. It was the next stage of his game. Jensen clenched her fists, knowing the hardest part was yet to come. Interrogating Daniel Cross was like staring into a void. He sat calmly in the interview room, shackled but relaxed, as though he were a guest at a dinner party. His voice was measured, his tone polite, but his words were dripping with cruelty. "You want me to tell you how?" he asked Jensen during their first exchange. "Or do you want me to tell you why?" She kept her composure, though her stomach twisted at the sight of him. His eyes were flat, devoid of emotion, yet brimming with arrogance. He spoke about his crimes not as tragedies but as experiments, describing the precision with which he studied his victims. He recounted Kaylee's final moments with chilling detail, even mimicking the way Boone had barked and lunged. Jensen felt her heart pound, her fists tighten. Every fiber of her being wanted to lunge across the table, but she forced herself to stay still. This wasn't about her rage. It was about justice. Cross never admitted guilt outright, but his words were damning. He described patterns, methods, and thoughts that aligned perfectly with the evidence from the cabin and bunker. "They were too easy," he said once, his lips curling into a thin smile. "No one was watching them. No one ever watches." Each word cut deeper into Jensen's resolve, yet also fueled her determination. She asked about accomplices, about the second handwriting in the journals, but Cross only tilted his head, amused. "You think I needed help?" he said softly. "People help me without even knowing it. Some open doors, some look away. That's all it takes." The implication chilled Jensen more than any direct confession could. If Cross had been aided, it wasn't by loyalty or conspiracy. It was by negligence, by blind eyes turned in the wrong direction. His cruelty wasn't just in the killing. It was in exposing how fragile trust really was. The impact on the victims' families was profound. For years, they had lived with uncertainty, wondering if their loved ones were alive or dead. Now they had a face, a name, a man sitting in chains. But the knowledge brought little comfort. Seeing Cross's calm demeanor on television, hearing whispers of his arrogance in the interrogation room, it was almost worse than the not knowing. Rachel Thornwell called Jensen after watching a news clip. Her voice was shaking with rage. How can he sit there like that? How can he smile? He should be rotting in the ground. Jensen listened quietly, her own heart echoing the same fury. She promised Rachel that justice would come, though she knew no verdict could erase the pain. The confrontation with Cross wasn't an ending. It was a wound reopened, bleeding fresh for everyone who had lost someone to him. In Blue Ridge, the arrest brought both relief and bitterness. People gathered in cafes, on porches, at the grocery store, whispering about the monster who had lived among them. Some remembered chatting with Cross when he worked odd jobs. Others recalled seeing him at the animal shelter, stroking dogs with gentle hands. The betrayal cut deep. He hadn't been a shadow in the woods all the time. He had walked their streets, shared their spaces, lived among them. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and the community felt that fracture keenly. Parents held their children closer, women looked twice at strangers, and every kind gesture was second-guessed. Cross had been exposed, but the damage he inflicted lingered like a toxin in the air. The arrest was not closure. It was confrontation, raw, brutal, and unhealed. For Jensen, the confrontation was both a victory and a torment. She had pursued him relentlessly, chased shadows, fought bureaucracy, and now, finally, she had a face to pin to the horror. But standing across from Daniel Cross, listening to his clinical cruelty, she realized the cost of justice. It wasn't triumph. It was scars carved deeper into her soul. Boone rested his head against her knee that night as she sat in silence at her kitchen table, staring at the wall. Cross was behind bars, but his words echoed in her ears. "Took you long enough." The bitterness cut. He was right. It had taken too long. Too many lives had been lost. Too many chances missed. Justice felt close, but painfully costly. And as Jensen drifted into restless sleep, she knew the hardest fight was still ahead. The reckoning had only begun. The trial of Daniel Cross began with a storm of media attention. News vans crowded outside the courthouse in Blue Ridge, satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters delivering live updates as if covering a war. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Families of the victims filled the benches, their faces pale with grief and determination. For them, this was not just a legal proceeding. It was the moment they had been forced to wait for through years of silence. Detective Laura Jensen sat near the front, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her eyes locked on the man who had haunted her dreams. Cross entered the courtroom wearing a plain prison jumpsuit, his hands cuffed. He looked thinner, older, but his composure remained unnerving. He scanned the room with a calm smile, as though none of it mattered. The sight sent ripples of rage through the families. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even pretending. The prosecution laid out its case with precision. They presented the journals, the trophies from the bunker, and the DNA evidence that tied Cross directly to Kaylee Thornwell and at least 3 other victims. Photographs of the crime scenes flashed on large screens, drawing gasps and tears from the audience. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had hunted deliberately, who had planned each step with chilling care. They emphasized his military training, his knowledge of anatomy, and his ability to vanish into the woods. This was not a man who lost control, the lead prosecutor told the jury. This was a man who controlled everything. Each word hit like a hammer. The families nodded, clinging to the hope that this would finally bring justice. Yet every time they glanced at Cross, their hope soured. He sat there, listening quietly, occasionally tilting his head as if amused. He seemed almost entertained. Cross's defense was equally disturbing. His attorneys claimed he was mentally unstable, unfit to be held fully accountable for his actions. They argued that his journals were evidence of delusion, that his military discharge had left him traumatized, and that his actions were the product of madness rather than malice. "He is sick," one defense attorney told the jury, voice heavy with false sympathy. "He needs treatment, not punishment." The words infuriated the families, who had waited too long for justice to see it twisted into pity. Jensen clenched her fists under the table, her jaw tight. She knew the difference between instability and cruelty. Cross wasn't sick in the way his lawyers claimed. He was calculated, meticulous, and proud of his crimes. She had read his words, seen the cold detail in his handwriting. He wasn't delusional. He was deliberate. And the thought of him escaping responsibility under the banner of insanity made her blood boil. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Rachel Thornwell took the stand. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale but resolute. In her hands, she carried Kaylee's childhood diary, a worn notebook covered in stickers. She opened it and began to read aloud, her voice trembling as she shared Kaylee's words about dreams, friends, and Boone, the dog she loved so much. "She wanted to be a teacher," Rachel said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She wanted to make the world better. And you took her from us." She turned toward Cross, her voice breaking into anger. "Look at me. Look at what you did." Cross did not flinch. He simply tilted his head, almost smiling. The jury shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Rachel's grief filling the room. Jensen wiped at her own eyes, silently vowing that Rachel's courage would not be wasted. The prosecution, in a bold move, called Boone into the courtroom. The golden retriever, now older but still strong, walked in beside Jensen, his nails clicking against the floor. Gasps rippled through the audience as Boone immediately locked his gaze on Cross. His ears went back, his teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Cross smirked at first, but the dog's intensity broke his facade. Boone lunged forward, restrained only by his handler, barking ferociously, eyes never leaving the man who had hurt his girl. The courtroom erupted, gasps, tears, shouts, before the judge called for order. For the jury, the moment was unforgettable. Boone remembered. Boone knew. The image of the dog's fury etched itself into their minds, a living testament to Kaylee's final moments. Jensen stroked Boone's head after he calmed, whispering, "Good boy." She knew then that Kaylee's spirit still lingered in the room, through the loyalty of the dog who had loved her most. Cross finally took the stand in his own defense, though his attorneys had warned against it. He spoke calmly, his voice even, as if lecturing a class. He denied nothing, but admitted little. Instead, he spoke in riddles, describing his crimes as studies, his victims as participants. When asked why he had done it, he shrugged. "Curiosity," he said. "I wanted to see how people break." The words sent a shudder through the courtroom. He went on to describe the purity of isolation in the woods, how the silence gave him clarity. "I was never hiding," he said, glancing at Jensen. "I was waiting." The smirk returned to his lips as he leaned back in his chair. For Jensen, it was confirmation of what she already knew. Daniel Cross was not insane. He was evil, and he wanted them all to know it. The jury's faces hardened. They had heard enough. Outside the courtroom, the town of Blue Ridge wrestled with its emotions. Some residents felt relief that the man who had haunted their community was finally caught. Others felt betrayed that he had lived among them unnoticed for so long. Cafes buzzed with whispered conversations, church sermons focused on healing, and neighbors comforted each other awkwardly. Yet under the surface, anger simmered. How many times had he walked their streets, shopped in their stores, spoken with their children? The thought was unbearable. The trust that had once bound the town together was fractured, replaced by suspicion and wariness. But amid the darkness, small sparks of resilience began to glow. Vigils were held not in silence, but in defiance. Families stood together, candles in hand, promising not to let fear define them. The trial was about Cross, but it was also about reclaiming their home. For Jensen, the trial became a mirror of her own life. She had spent years chasing shadows, haunted by her daughter's disappearance. Now she was face to face with a predator who embodied every nightmare she had endured. Sitting through testimony, reviewing evidence, and listening to Cross's chilling words wore her down, but it also solidified her resolve. She began to see her work not just as justice for Kaylee, but as justice for all the women whose names filled the cold case files. Late one night, she visited the graves of each identified victim, leaving a single flower and whispering an apology. "I should have found him sooner," she murmured, her voice breaking. But as she stood there, Boone leaning against her leg, she felt something shift. Maybe justice was never perfect. Maybe it was always late. But it still mattered. It still had weight. And she would carry it for them. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. The foreman stood, unfolding the paper with trembling hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Cross, guilty on all counts." The words unleashed a wave of emotion. Families wept openly, some clutching each other, others bowing their heads in relief. Rachel Thornwell collapsed into tears, her body shaking as Jensen wrapped an arm around her. Mitch Thornwell, quieter than anyone, simply closed his eyes, whispering his daughter's name. Cross sat unmoved, his expression calm, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. He had lost, but he didn't seem to care. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he leaned toward the microphone. "This isn't over," he said softly. "There are others." The words sent a chill through the room. It was both a taunt and a warning. The judge sentenced Cross to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, though they were bittersweet. No punishment could bring back the victims. No sentence could erase the scars. But it was something. It was accountability. It was a name, a face, a man in chains. For Jensen, it was both victory and torment. She had fought for this moment, bled for it, sacrificed for it. Yet as she watched Cross being led away, she felt no relief. His smirk lingered in her mind, his words echoing, "There are others." She knew it wasn't just bravado. The journals, the photographs, the second handwriting, all suggested that the nightmare was bigger than one man. Cross was behind bars, but the shadow he cast stretched further. The reckoning wasn't just about him. It was about the system that had failed, the silence that had allowed him to thrive. That night, Blue Ridge held a vigil in the town square. Hundreds gathered, candles glowing against the dark, voices rising in song and prayer. Photographs of Kaylee and the other victims were displayed on easels, surrounded by flowers. Jensen stood at the edge of the crowd, Boone at her side, watching silently. Rachel approached her, eyes red from crying, but with a small smile. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Jensen nodded, though her chest ached. "We did," she replied. They stood together in silence, the flames flickering in the breeze. For a moment, the weight lifted. For a moment, Blue Ridge felt whole again. But deep down, Jensen knew the truth. This was not the end. The reckoning had come, but the aftermath would stretch on for years. Justice had been served, but the shadow would linger. And somewhere beyond the mountains, in places still untouched, the silence of the woods remained. The trial of Daniel Cross ended with a guilty verdict, and for the first time in years, Blue Ridge exhaled. The weight that had pressed down on the town, silent and suffocating, seemed to lift ever so slightly. Cross was locked away, his smirk now just a memory burned into court sketches and news footage. For many, it marked the end of the nightmare. Yet for others, the scars remained. Healing, they learned, was not a switch to be flipped but a slow and uneven process. Families gathered to bury their dead properly, laying to rest remains that had been hidden for too long. The Thornwells held a private service for Kaylee, this time not just in grief, but with a small measure of peace that justice had been served. Rachel clutched Boone's collar as she placed fresh flowers on Kaylee's grave, whispering, "We found him, baby. We found him." The community came together in ways that surprised even longtime residents. Volunteers organized to clean the overgrown trail where Kaylee had walked her last steps, cutting back weeds and repairing the fallen sign. When the work was finished, the town council voted unanimously to rename it Kaylee's Path. At the trailhead, a new wooden arch was built, engraved with her name and the words, "Forever loved, never forgotten." Families gathered for the dedication ceremony, holding hands, some crying, others smiling through their tears. The once feared forest trail was reclaimed, no longer a place of whispers and avoidance, but a place of remembrance and strength. Children ran along the path that day, laughter mingling with birdsong. For Blue Ridge, it was a symbolic act of healing, a way to take back what had been stolen, not just from Kaylee, but from the entire town. Detective Laura Jensen stood quietly at the dedication, Boone sitting beside her, his golden fur catching the sunlight. She had declined to speak at the ceremony, preferring to watch from the back. This was Kaylee's day, not hers. Still, neighbors and strangers alike approached her, thanking her for never giving up. She accepted their gratitude with humility, though she carried her own private burden. To her, justice was never clean. It was messy, delayed, imperfect. She thought of all the nights she had spent staring at the journals, of the faces of other women still unnamed, of the whisper Cross had left them all with, "There are others." As the crowd cheered the ribbon cutting, Jensen stroked Boone's head and whispered, "It's not over." She knew the town needed closure, but she also knew that true justice was still incomplete. Cross had been captured, but his shadow lingered. The Thornwells' lives would never return to what they had been, but they began to find new ways to honor their daughter's memory. Rachel returned from Florida and settled in a small house near downtown, where she started a non-profit foundation in Kaylee's name. Its mission was to support families of missing persons, providing resources and advocacy for cases that risked going cold. The foundation quickly grew, drawing donations and volunteers from across the state. Rachel poured her grief into the work, determined that no other family should feel abandoned the way she had. Mitch remained quieter, still scarred by years of silence, but he began attending foundation events, slowly finding purpose in the cause. Together, they were no longer just grieving parents. They were advocates, carrying Kaylee's spirit forward into something that might save others. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. For Jensen, life after the trial was a strange mix of relief and emptiness. She continued her work with the sheriff's office, but her focus shifted. She spent more time mentoring younger detectives, teaching them the lessons she had learned the hard way. Never dismiss a tip, never assume a case is unsolvable, never let bureaucracy silence you. She lectured at the police academy, telling Kaylee's story to recruits, not as a tale of victory but as a warning of the cost of delay. Boone, now aging but still loyal, accompanied her everywhere. At the academy, cadets smiled at the sight of the old retriever padding down the halls, a living piece of history. Jensen often told them, that dog solved the case as much as any of us. He never forgot. And neither should we. Boone's presence was a reminder that justice was not abstract. It was flesh and blood, loyalty and loss. The prison where Daniel Cross was sent became a place of curiosity for some and dread for others. Journalists speculated endlessly about his final words. There are others, dissecting them on podcasts and documentaries. Some believed it was merely a taunt, a way for him to maintain control even in defeat. Others feared it was a confession, a hint that accomplices were still free or that bodies remained undiscovered. The FBI quietly continued its work, cross-referencing Cross's journals with unsolved cases across multiple states. New searches were launched in wooded areas he had once frequented, though no additional remains were immediately found. Jensen followed these updates closely, though she told no one. In her gut, she believed Cross had been telling the truth. He wasn't done, because men like him never truly acted alone. Whether by accomplices or imitators, the darkness he had nurtured would spread if they didn't keep fighting. Blue Ridge itself transformed in the aftermath. The fear that had once defined it slowly gave way to resilience. The annual Fall Festival, canceled the year after Kaylee's murder, returned with renewed energy. Locals decorated booths with sunflowers, Kaylee's favorite, in her honor. Tourists slowly trickled back, drawn by the story of a community that had faced its darkest hour and survived. Murals appeared on downtown walls, painted by local artists, images of Kaylee smiling, Boone by her side, framed by the Appalachian Hills. The town still carried scars, but it also carried pride. It had been shaken, but not destroyed. Blue Ridge had reclaimed its identity, no longer just the town of the murder, but a town that fought back. Each step forward was a reminder that the killer had failed to erase them. Life continued, stubborn and defiant, against the weight of tragedy. One evening, months after the trial, Jensen walked Kaylee's path alone with Boone. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine and the rustle of leaves. She paused at the clearing where Kaylee had been found, now marked with a small bench and a plaque. Sitting down, she let Boone rest his head on her lap. The woods were quiet, but not menacing anymore. For the first time, she felt peace in that place. She closed her eyes, whispering a promise to Kaylee. We stopped him. We did what we could. Boone sighed softly, as though agreeing. Jensen stayed there until the stars began to appear, the forest bathed in moonlight. She knew the shadows would always exist, but she also knew that light had returned. For Kaylee, for the others, for herself. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was justice enough to keep going. Yet even in peace, the mystery lingered. Months after Cross's sentencing, the FBI uncovered a final chilling piece of evidence. Hidden in the back of one of the journals, overlooked during earlier reviews, was a hand-drawn map. It marked not only the cabin and bunker in Blue Ridge, but also several other sites across state lines. Some were old logging camps, others remote caves. One location, circled in red, had never been searched. When agents visited it, they found a campsite, recently abandoned. The ashes in the fire pit were still warm. Whoever had been there was gone, but signs suggested it hadn't been Cross. The discovery left investigators shaken. Had he worked with someone? Had he inspired a copycat? The question remained unanswered. For Jensen, the news was both infuriating and unsurprising. Evil rarely ended with one man. The fight was never truly over. The community of Blue Ridge chose not to dwell on what-ifs. They chose, instead, to celebrate the lives that had been lost. Each year, on the anniversary of Kaylee's death, they held a candlelight vigil at the trailhead of Kaylee's path. Families, friends, and neighbors gathered, holding candles against the night, sharing stories, laughter, and tears. It became not just a memorial but a tradition of resilience, a way to remind themselves that even in the face of horror, they could stand together. Jensen attended every year, Boone by her side until his final days. When Boone eventually passed, the town honored him with a bronze statue at the trailhead, depicting him sitting faithfully, his gaze fixed on the forest. The plaque read, "The dog who remembered." Visitors touched the statue for luck, leaving flowers and notes. Boone's loyalty became a symbol of hope, proof that even in darkness, love endured. Detective Jensen eventually retired, but not into silence. She wrote a book about the case, not filled with sensational details, but with lessons about persistence, compassion, and the cost of justice. She donated the proceeds to Rachel's Foundation, ensuring that Kaylee's name would continue to help others. She traveled occasionally to speak at conferences, but always returned to Blue Ridge, the town she had fought to protect. Her home became quieter, the halls empty without Boone, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. When she visited Kaylee's grave, she no longer whispered apologies. Instead, she spoke words of gratitude. "You reminded me why I fight," she said softly. "And I'll keep fighting." In the quiet of the cemetery, with the wind rustling through the trees, Jensen finally felt something she hadn't in years: peace. As the years passed, Blue Ridge healed. Children played freely again, tourists returned, and the woods, once feared, became loved again. Yet the memory of Kaylee Thornwell lingered, etched into the town's soul. Her story was told in classrooms, her name engraved on plaques, her face painted in murals. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of resilience, of a town that refused to be broken. And though the shadow of Daniel Cross remained in documentaries and podcasts, Blue Ridge chose to focus on Kaylee's light. For them, she was not defined by her final moments, but by the life she lived, the laughter, the kindness, the love she gave. Her path, once dark, now glowed with candles and flowers, a beacon for anyone who walked it. Blue Ridge had been scarred, but it had healed. Slowly, painfully, but fully. And yet, one question lingered, one that Jensen herself asked in her final lecture before retirement. Standing before a class of young detectives, she posed it with quiet gravity. "Do you believe killers ever truly work alone?" The room fell silent, each recruit processing the weight of the words. It wasn't just a question about Daniel Cross. It was a question about the world, about vigilance, about the thin line between safety and danger. It was a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, that silence can be deadly, and that justice requires relentless pursuit.